Now, we all know that SpongeBob has some really bad, triggering, and straight up disgusting episodes. But today, I want to do something different and find something that's actually good about all of them. To do this, we're going to be going through the worst rated episodes of every season, starting with the worst episode from season 1, with a rating of 8.2 out of 10, Squeaky Boots. And this episode is just about what you would expect from a title like that. The entirety of the episode is literally just SpongeBob going around and making these annoying squeaky noises with his new boots. This goes so far to the point where it literally gives Mr. Krabs PTSD from the noises. And overall, this is just a really unpleasant episode to watch. Usually, SpongeBob annoys a character in the episodes like Squidward, and it's entertaining for us the viewers. But in this one, SpongeBob is literally just trying to annoy the audience. And the repeated joke of SpongeBob's boots being squeaky starts to get annoying really fast. But what I will say is even though SpongeBob's squeaky boots were really annoying, Mr. Krabs' descent into madness throughout the episode is really funny to watch. And it probably reflects what all of us were thinking while watching the episode. Another thing that I really like about the episode is that Mr. Krabs' way of getting rid of the boots is literally eating them. So at the end of the episode, we get a gag where he starts squeaking when he talks, which is probably deserved for having such a dumb solution to that problem. But before we move on to the most hated episode of season 2, I see you guys watching there without being subscribed. And hey, we just started the channel, so you might as well help me out. But now, let's go on to the most hated episode of season 2. I'm with Stupid, and this episode has an 8.4 out of 10 rating on IMDb, which is a really high rating for the lowest episode in an entire season. And it really goes to show how loved OG SpongeBob was. This episode centers around Patrick and his family coming to visit, but the problem is that Patrick's parents think that he's really dumb. So SpongeBob, being a good friend, decides to help Patrick out by acting dumber than him, which theoretically would make Patrick seem less dumb. And it makes sense why Patrick dreaded his parents coming over so much. They treat him like absolute garbage. But thankfully, right on cue, SpongeBob shows up, and he starts acting really dumb, which starts to make Patrick's parents think that Patrick isn't as dumb as they think. But this quickly backfires and starts to become really mean-spirited, as it ends up with Patrick and his family just straight up bullying SpongeBob to a point where it's not funny anymore. For most of the visit, Patrick loves the attention. He finally feels like the smartest person in the room, but the plan falls apart when Patrick starts teasing SpongeBob too, hurting his friend's feelings. Just as their argument reaches its peak, another pair of starfish knock on the door. These newcomers reveal that they're actually Patrick's real parents, and Patrick's fake parents, Janet and Marty, remember that they don't even have a son.
Oh, that's right, honey. We don't have a son.
I think it's just in starfish DNA to be really stupid, and I see why people might hate this episode. From Patrick feeling out of character, to the creators using the same joke of bullying SpongeBob over and over again, it makes sense. But honestly, I think the entire premise is really funny, and I think that the twist of his fake parents realizing that they're not actually Patrick's parents at the end is just great. And this episode still has a lot of that classic SpongeBob charm for me. But now, let's move on to the worst rated episode of season 3, The Sponge Who Could Fly. And this episode was a lot different than usual. First of all, the episode is technically considered the Lost SpongeBob episode. It's 22 minutes long instead of the typical 11-minute runtime. And the reason for this is because there's an extra 11-minute segment of the episode where Patchy the Pirate is searching for the Lost SpongeBob episode. And weirdly, what I do really like about this episode is how different it feels at the beginning with seeing Patchy the Pirate searching for the lost episode. I've always loved the live action scenes in the show, and something about them is just really nostalgic to me. But after nearly 8 minutes of build-up, the actual cartoon part with the lost episode is just fine. It's about SpongeBob trying to fly like a jellyfish. He gets made fun of by Bikini Bottom, and then eventually flies by accident. It's not terrible, but definitely not worthy of being called a lost episode. Fans expected something epic, or creepy, or special, but instead, they got a basic filler plot. Imagine being promised a secret forbidden episode, and then it's just SpongeBob floating on a hairdryer. While that may have been kinda boring, I never really hated this one, and generally, this is still considered really good compared to how low some of the ratings dip later on this list. But coming in as the worst rated episode of season 4, we have The Gift of Gum, with a 6.7 out of 10 rating on IMDb, and it's easy to see why, because the premise of this episode is Patrick giving SpongeBob the gift of a giant, disgusting ball of gum. And this thing is just really, really nasty. But for some reason, SpongeBob actually likes the gift initially. But then after Underwear crawls out and literally starts talking to him, he decides his mission throughout the rest of the episode is to find new ways to throw away that gum without Patrick noticing. And that's another part of why this episode is so hated for a lot of people. The plot is just really one-dimensional and keeps focusing on just this basic premise, and it starts to get really repetitive to watch. But what I did really like about the episode is this part. At the very end, Patrick blows a giant gum bubble, accidentally covering the entire town in gum, which I think is another high point of the episode for me. I think if the gum wasn't nasty, it could have been a way better episode, because Patrick hoarding a giant wad of gum seems very in line with his character. But now, let's move on to the worst rated episode of season 5, which is To Love a Patty, with a 5.7 out of 10 rating. Yup, the whole plot of this episode is SpongeBob developing a romantic obsession with a Krabby Patty he cooked. He names it Patty and takes it on several dates, sings to it, and treats it like a literal girlfriend. At first, it's just weird, but then it gets disturbing. As the days pass, the patty starts rotting. It turns green, grows mold, smells horrendous, and SpongeBob refuses to let it go. There are several scenes of him cuddling and kissing this decomposing burger, and by the end, it looks like something out of a zombie movie. Instead of being a goofy SpongeBob style joke, the episode plays it uncomfortably straight. SpongeBob acts genuinely obsessed, like a stalker in a horror film, and the other characters, especially Mr. Krabs, seems too scared to intervene. The vibe goes from, yeah, he just loves burgers, to this man needs therapy and possibly a biohazard team. And this episode really relies too heavily on visual gags, and him eating the patty at the end actually made me a little bit sick. But what's good about this episode? Well, for one, the musical number with SpongeBob singing to his patty in the episode actually went pretty hard.
Oh baby, they may call me a fool.
And that's pretty much the only redeeming quality I could find. The rest of this episode is actually just pretty bad, but it only gets worse when we move on to the lowest rated episode of season 6, the Splinter, coming in at, believe it or not, a 4 out of 10 rating. So with a rating that bad, what makes this episode so unbearable? Well, for starters, the episode leans hard into gross out body horror. SpongeBob gets a tiny splinter, but instead of playing it for a quick gag, the show zooms in on it over and over. You get close-ups of the swollen, pus-filled wound, red, throbbing skin, goo squirting out, and so much more. It's the kind of stuff that makes you physically uncomfortable while watching. Even fans who usually enjoy SpongeBob's slapstick or gross jokes say that this one went too far. Literally, this whole episode just revolves around his splinter, and at the end, when Mr. Krabs removes it, it's just about as disgusting as you could imagine. Also, in this episode, Patrick pretends to be a doctor and shoves trash and a hammer into SpongeBob's wound as treatment, and this makes the situation horrifyingly worse. He's not funny here, just gross, useless, and borderline evil. Fans really hated how far Patrick's character was flanderized here. But what could possibly be good about an episode this bad? As much as the visuals make people gag, you have to admit, the animators went all in, even if it was disgusting. The sound design, the squishes, the pops, the oozes, it's all disturbingly accurate. If the goal was to make viewers feel the pain SpongeBob was in, then mission accomplished, I give it to him. But now, let's go on to season 7, where we literally have the worst rated episode of the entire show. That being A Pal for Gary, with an abysmal rating of 3.3 out of 10. It starts like any normal day, with SpongeBob feeding Gary. SpongeBob starts to go off for work, but poor Gary just wants to go for a walk, which makes Gary really sad. But it turns out he was just guilt tripping SpongeBob, because when he leaves, he uses the leash to grab a bunch of stuff and starts watching a cowboy show. So it turns out bro is actually just completely fine. But SpongeBob at work starts to get worried and feels bad for Gary. So he calls him for some reason, which just makes SpongeBob feel even worse. So after getting off work, SpongeBob tries to find a solution to balance his responsibilities at the Krusty Krab while also being a good pet owner to Gary. But when he's walking home, he finds a stand selling pets, which gives SpongeBob the idea to get a friend for Gary. The lady selling them tried to warn him that this isn't just any normal pet, but SpongeBob has negative brain cells, so he didn't exactly pick up on that. Back at home, and this thing is already acting really weird. SpongeBob names his pet Puffy Fluffy and lets him near Gary, but he nearly kills Gary any chance he gets when SpongeBob isn't looking. But as soon as SpongeBob gets involved, he goes back to looking completely innocent, like nothing ever happened. Things only get worse when SpongeBob puts them in bed together alone, which is probably the worst thing he could have done. SpongeBob still doesn't understand, so he brings Gary back downstairs to Puffy Fluffy, who seems to be sleeping nice and cute in a little ball. But when SpongeBob leaves, it turns out that this isn't Puffy Fluffy. It's actually just a ball of his shed skin. And when Gary goes back to the kitchen, he finds out that Puffy Fluffy evolved into a giant monster in the kitchen looking for anything to feed its appetite. And this thing is horrifying. Meanwhile, SpongeBob is still sleeping, so Gary is left by himself to fight off the giant monster. But he's just too weak and can't really do anything to defeat him. After a chase through the house over the entire night, SpongeBob finally wakes up, sees his house destroyed, and even after all this, he still blames Gary, even while he's being eaten by Puffy Fluffy. Most hated SpongeBob episodes in this video are just gross or lazy, but this one is straight up mean. It feels like emotional torture more than a goofy pet episode. There's no humor, no payoff, and no lesson. Just SpongeBob being blind and letting Gary suffer for it. SpongeBob was completely responsible for everything that happened in this episode, and it's really frustrating to watch Gary get tortured for literally no reason. But what could possibly be good about this? Well, it's definitely hard to think of something. The horror animation and transformation scenes were actually really well done. You can't deny that the animators went all in, and the transformation from a cute critter to a nightmare eel is smooth and pretty intense. And another plus is that Gary actually gets some spotlight in this episode, showing that he's not just a useless snail, but he actually is really powerful and even managed to defeat Puffy Fluffy. But other than that, yeah, this episode is pretty trash. But now let's look at something a little better, which happens to be the lowest rated episode of season 8, Demolition Doofus, coming in at a depressing 4.5 out of 10 rating. And in this episode, no joke, the main plot is that Mrs. Puff gets injured while on a driving test, and this makes her body permanently deflated. And after this, she vows to get revenge on SpongeBob for ruining her life. So what does she do? Well, she signs them both up for a demolition derby in an attempt to get SpongeBob killed. And she's not joking around. She actively cheers for his death, tries to steer him into danger, and even lies about the event being safe. This isn't cartoon violence in a Looney Tunes way. It's just dark and straight up uncomfortable. A lot of fans found it depressing and out of sync with SpongeBob's usual charm. It's one of those episodes where no one is likable, not even SpongeBob. And somehow, SpongeBob is so bad at driving that he actually ends up accidentally making everyone crash into each other, coming out looking like an absolute driving god. So then, Mrs. Puff tries to go demolish SpongeBob herself, but SpongeBob is too clueless to even know what's going on, so they accidentally crash back into boating school, where Mrs. Puff becomes Puffy again. Mrs. Puff was super mean-spirited in this episode, but what I really liked about this one is just how dumb and unaware of what's going on in the world SpongeBob is. But now, let's move on to season 9, and the worst episode of this season was SpongeBob, You're Fired, with a 4.5 out of 10 rating. And weirdly enough, this episode got a lot of political backlash from outlets like Fox News and the New York Post, who claimed it was a message against government assistance, which is already a really weird thing to claim about a SpongeBob episode. So let's see why this is. It starts off with a bunch of SpongeBob's normal antics in the Krusty Krab. When Mr. Krabs finds out that he's able to save a literal nickel a day if you fire SpongeBob, he decides to fire him. And SpongeBob predictably instantly becomes a mess. He goes back home and he's super depressed. But then Patrick comes barging in, literally, and shows him the wonders of the unemployed lifestyle, which I am very familiar with personally because I sit in a dark basement making videos about cartoons all day. But anyways, SpongeBob tries being unemployed, which Patrick calls fun employment, but SpongeBob gets bored after a while, so he tries working at some other places. But none of these 3 places he tries working at actually works out, and eventually, at the end of the episode, he goes back to working at the Krusty Krab. This episode is generally pretty bad, because watching SpongeBob suffer and fail job after job just isn't fun. It's depressing. He becomes hopeless, gets mocked, and struggles while trying to stay cheerful. SpongeBob is about about underwater nonsense and jellyfishing, not real-world poverty and employment struggles. This episode felt too grounded and too real, and not in a good way. But the one thing about this episode that I do like is that SpongeBob always stays somewhat optimistic. Even after being fired multiple times, SpongeBob doesn't give up. He tries new jobs and tries to help others wherever he goes. Not because he has to, but because he genuinely cares and wants a purpose. And he's not too big of a fan of that whole fun employment thing. But anyways, now let's move on to the worst episode of season 10, Patrick's Coupon, with a 5.8 out of 10 rating. It starts off with Patrick and his rock fighting a sea spider when he finds a lost ice cream coupon. And the biggest complaint from fans is that this episode is just plain boring. The plot is literally Patrick trying to redeem an expired ice cream coupon, and it drags for 11 minutes straight. There's no big twists, no exciting conflict, and there are barely any jokes that land. The pacing is sluggish and almost nothing happens. Fans expected something funny, but instead they just got a lesson on how coupons work. The jokes in this episode revolve around coupon policy and technicalities. That might work in an adult sitcom, but in SpongeBob, it just feels dull and out of place. Most of the comedy comes from Patrick not understanding that his coupon is expired. But the one good thing about this episode is the art and the backgrounds were really solid. Despite the weak plot, the visuals are really cool, especially in the ice cream headquarters place that Patrick goes to. It's a rare case of the background art and the setting outshining the actual story. But now let's move on to the worst episode of season 11, Ink Lemonade. And things are really going from boring to rough again, with this having a 4.9 out of 10 rating. The episode starts with Patrick having a lemonade stand, but it looks like he's actually just selling water, so Squidward gives him some garbage to put in his water, and right away, it's easy to see why this episode is so hated. But then, SpongeBob scares Squidward, which makes him bust ink everywhere. And then, of course, Patrick starts serving this, because he's Patrick, I don't think he has a brain, but for some reason, everyone likes drinking Squidward's ink. So then, Patrick goes back out to get more, and he realizes that if he scares Squidward, he can get more of his ink and sell it to make a profit. So this sets up an episode of just full-on Squidward torture, and Patrick messing with Squidward in the most brutal ways possible. From a giant spider to a haunted house full of things meant to scare him, this episode is one of the worst examples of Squidward torture. But then Squidward realizes that they're profiting off of him. So Squidward starts his own stand, advertising it as getting ink right from the source. But then disaster happens when he realizes he can't produce ink himself on his own will, and he only produces it when he's scared, which doesn't line up with any other times in the show when he was scared, but whatever, it's SpongeBob, nothing makes sense. Anyways, he gets a customer to scare him, and he splooges ink over everyone, and then no one wants it anymore because they realize it's kind of gross. This episode was pretty bad, with all the Squidward torture and gross out humor with Squidward's ink, and you can't forget Patrick's weird lemonade at the beginning of the episode. But the only good part, in my opinion, is... oh man, this is a hard one, isn't it? I think this would be a perfect episode if it didn't have the ink part. So if we just cut all around that and removed the parts with Patrick scaring Squidward to get the ink, which is 90% of the episode, I think it would be pretty good. But now, let's move on to the worst episode of season 12, the Nitwiting. The episode revolves around SpongeBob and Patrick joining a club called the Nitwits, where the entire purpose is to act like morons and cause chaos. But instead of fun cartoon nonsense, the episode turns into mindless destruction, and they do it all with zero awareness or consequence. Even fans who enjoy SpongeBob's dumb humor found this one too brain dead to enjoy. There's no plot, and it's just basically random scenes struck together. This is literally the definition of modern SpongeBob. This episode is basically just SpongeBob and Patrick joining a club, they put on plungers and helmets, and then it's 11 minutes of just random destruction, yelling, and noise. There's no goal, no progression, or real jokes. It's just a lot of mindless filler. In classic SpongeBob, the characters were goofy but lovable, and in this episode, they're just completely unhinged, acting like feral toddlers with no moral compass. In this episode, there is nothing left of the characters the fans used to know, but one thing I do really like about this episode is seeing how small Patrick's brain really is. It really makes me wonder how bro even functions. I also like how the club is literally in a cardboard box, but inside, it's massive radioactive. It makes me wonder how that's even physically possible. Wait, never mind. It's SpongeBob. Nothing ever makes sense. But let's move on to the worst rated episode of season 13, Chums, with a 4.9 out of 10 rating. And it starts with another one of Plankton's schemes to steal the secret formula. But Plankton, in his effort, unfortunately gets knocked down the drain and ends up in a bunch of really gross situations. But when he gets down into the sewer system, he finds a weird chum monster down there. And these people weirdly start obeying him. And the reason they're down there is because of all the chum Plankton is flushed down the drain from the chum bucket. And for some reason, when it mixes with the gas of the sewer, it creates living chum people. The rest of this episode pretty much revolves around him inside of his chum kingdom, until Plankton obviously gets the idea to use this to steal the secret formula, but their plans get foiled when SpongeBob accidentally hoses him with the water again. Plankton ends this episode right back where he started, friendless, alone, and still wanting to steal the Krabby Patty secret formula. It feels like the show in this episode just went out of its way to punish Plankton for existing, but one of the good things about it is that I have to say it's pretty creative having a whole sewer system network of living chum monsters. I feel like the writers must have been on something while writing this one, I can't even lie. But now, let's talk about the worst episode of season 14, Don't Make Me Laugh, with a 6.2 out of 10 rating. In this episode, SpongeBob and Patrick go to see a movie, but while they're laughing at a funny scene, SpongeBob's funny bone gets locked in position, and he can't stop laughing. He's literally not even in control of it anymore. And that is literally the entire premise of this episode. And it's honestly kind of boring and slightly annoying. The entire episode is just SpongeBob not being able to stop laughing, and this predictably messes up his life in a bunch of ways. But it's not until he realizes that his grandma can't stop laughing either, because her funny bone also got stuck in place. And it actually happens to all of SpongeBob's family, and they kind of just laugh it off and nothing ever gets resolved. Although this episode was really annoying, I mean, it about fit the par for modern SpongeBob. The one good thing I have to say about this episode, though, is I have to give props to Tom Kenny. This had to have been the absolute hardest episode to film, because he was doing the SpongeBob laugh for pretty much 12 minutes straight, and considering he probably had to do redos as well, I can't imagine how hard this episode had to have been to film, and I have to respect that. But for our final episode, let's look at one from the brand new season 15, and the ratings might not be accurate yet because it's so new, so I'm gonna go off my personal least favorite for this season, and try to find something that's good about it. My pick for season 15 is A Taste of Plankton, and this one is absolutely disgusting. Basically, SpongeBob steps on Plankton and thinks that he's gum, and it ends up with Plankton sticking to his tongue throughout the entire episode. Once he's stuck to his tongue with glue, he predictably tries to use this as a way to steal the secret formula, but it doesn't work, and this is probably one of the worst SpongeBob gross out episodes. Like, this one's kind of just hard to watch. Yeah, this one really sucked. The only good thing about it was Patrick's armpit. Yeah, that's about it. But because you watched all the way to the end, you should find one good thing about my channel, the juicy red subscribe button down there. You better click it. This is a threat.